Hi, good morning. This is Troy Torres with Kandit News. I'm reporting with Johnny Rosario here at the District Court of Guam. We are here for the pickup of the trial against Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser, and Henry Alvendia, the star witness for the prosecution, still is on the stand. Actually, he will probably be on the stand through tomorrow. Right now, Attorney David Lujan, who is the attorney for Juanita Moser, is cross-examining Mr. Alvendia. When we come back from the break in about 5 minutes, he will be. But before Mr. Lujan went on this morning, Peter Perez, the attorney for Raymond Martinez, finished up his cross-examination of Mr. Alvendia, which picked up from Friday, which the Kandit News group will still be providing you guys with a written story on what happened Friday, because it was a lot. But to pick up from today, Mr. Alvendia was asked by Mr. Perez a series of questions, first regarding his honesty. And Mr. Perez asked Mr. Alvendia several times whether it's true that all his communication with Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser was conducted under false pretenses. And each time Mr. Alvendia said, "I don't agree with that word," and Mr. Perez would refer Mr. Alvendia to his own testimony in the last trial, where he agreed that he lured them under false pretenses. And so Mr. Alvendia, when he was pressed, says, quote, "What it all boils down to is I played a role," unquote. That's in reference to the confidential informant role that he played for the federal government. So Mr. Perez asked him, "So are you playing a role right now?" And he said, "No, he's not." There were several questions like these where Mr. Alvendia was stumped, and Mr. Perez was just not. He would press and press and press. On the other question that he asked is, would you agree that law enforcement officers are capable of corruption? And Mr. Alvendia said no, and then Mr. Perez referred him to his previous statements where he said yes, and where he said that yes, law enforcement officers are capable of corruption. And Mr. Perez pressed him by asking him, "Well, aren't you a corrupt former law enforcement officer? Did you not commit acts of corruption as you were a law enforcement officer?" And there was a lot of beating around the bush, and finally the judge told Mr. Alvendia to answer the question. Then Mr. Lujan came up and started his cross-examination. He went to the facts of the lead agent on this case, Mr. Erfel Matanguian, being one of Mr. Alvendia's colleagues since 1995, and also the other agent on the case, Erwin Farron with Homeland Security Investigations, having attended the Criminal Justice Academy together with Mr. Alvendia, having become recruits at Customs with Mr. Alvendia together, and then working at Customs through the years 1995 through 1999 or 2000, and then again when Mr. Alvendia was forced to resign from U.S. Customs and go back to Guam Customs by Ralph Scambaluri. And so there was the establishment of that. But the most of Mr. Lujan's cross-examination has been on Mr. Alvendia's prior crimes involving the Customs Corruption Scandal with Mr. Ruel Valencia who was the cooperating defendant against Mr. Alvendia from 2011 through 2015, when Mr. Alvendia was finally indicted. But from 2011, Mr. Valencia was a cooperating defendant who went undercover for the federal government to expose Mr. Alvendia, and according to Fred Black, the assistant U.S. attorney, supposedly to go after Ralph Scambaluri, which never materialized. But Mr. Lujan spent the morning basically impeaching Mr. Alvendia's credibility and his witness statements. Every time Mr. Lujan would ask Mr. Alvendia a question about his complicity, his criminality during those years, Mr. Alvendia would shirk from admitting any of it, which would be a departure from his previous statements where he plainly admits to his wrongdoing. But today he says that he made a mistake. He has apologized for that mistake, and he takes responsibility for that mistake. but he refuses to call what he did corruption. And there was actually a light, well, not a light moment. It was just a funny thing when Mr. Lujan was asked, or when Mr. Alvendia was asked by Mr. Lujan, did you not accept bribes? Did you not accept money in return for, or as payment for the favors that you were doing for Mr. Valencia? And Mr. Alvendia said no. And Mr. Lujan said, well, I don't understand. It says here that you received money, you received bribes. It says here in the indictment. And Mr. Alvendia says, well, you know, I didn't want the money. He would throw it at me. And Mr. Lujan, he made a thing out of it where he says he took Mr. Alvendia through the crimes, and at the end of that he says, when Mr. Alvendia agrees, well, really doesn't have a choice but to agree with everything Mr. Lujan is saying, Mr. Lujan says to him, quote, so it's not just that Valencia's throwing out money and you not wanting it, isn't that correct? And he forks out a wad of cash and he throws it on the table in front of him. It was quite dramatic and a little funny. So we're going to go back into the trial. We'll have more of an update for you later on. Thank you for listening to this live update of the Alvendia Corruption Scandal and the Martinez and Moser trial.